I think we have to start with the final lap, maybe the final laps, I should say, kind of what led up to this situation here. Sammy Smith, from multiple car lengths back, I would say, really reminiscent of the move that Austin Dillon pulled on Joey Logano, just absolutely dive bombed it into turn 3, hit the back end of Taylor Gray. Taylor Gray spun out, got relegated to, I believe, 29th place, if I recall correctly. Yeah, there you go. So he thought he was set to win the race, or probably at worst finish second or third. But instead of a bump and run, it looked like it ended up being a dump and run, regardless of whatever intentions Sammy Smith had. Certainly took it a little too far in the eyes of a lot of people, and also in the eyes of the CW booth. And I think, Tanner, so I was referencing the conversation that we were having in our Slack chat on Saturday night. We'll start with this here. You and I, obviously looked at the Phoenix incident and looked at this incident. You saw the CW booth, I think, as being a little bit hypocritical, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here with how you saw it. But of course, the CW booth kind of called the Phoenix incident clean. Alex Bowman still came across the line in second, certainly got used up. But looking at the chaos of what we saw Saturday night, they had no problem calling that out. Do you see that as hypocritical here? And then just generally speaking, what were your thoughts on the incident that we saw, incidents, I guess I should say, on the final lap on Saturday night?
Well, first of all, I'd like to clarify that what Sammy Smith pulled was more of a dump and fall than a dump and run, because if you dump and run, the point is for you to go and win. And he did not, in fact, go on to do that. So just wanted to make sure that's clear. As for the Phoenix incident and kind of how it relates to what we saw on Saturday night in the Xfinity Series race, Eric Almirola at Phoenix completely wiped out Alex Bowman coming to the finish line and junked his car in a pursuit to win. And to Almirola's credit, he did end up winning that race, and perhaps that was worth it for him. I didn't really see it as a very honorable move as a race car driver, we'll say, but it's NASCAR, we invite contact, yada, yada, yada. As far as Saturday is concerned, I think Mike Joy put it best that it would be detrimental to dumpster fires everywhere if we called what happened Saturday night a dumpster fire, because dumpster fires are contained. And I definitely agree with him there. So to kind of give a brief recap of what happened, in one of the late restarts, Sammy Smith got into Taylor Gray going into turn 1 at Martinsville, something we've seen probably throughout the entire history of that track, dating back to the 1940s. Someone dove into a corner and moved someone out of the way. Smith took the lead, then coming back to the white, another caution came out, forcing overtime. Well, Gray lined up right behind Smith, and sure enough, on the ensuing restart, he moved Sammy up the track. They were even and square. They raced through 3 and 4 without making any sort of contact, as they were still side by side. Then they went back into turn 1, and Gray washed up to about half of a groove away from going into the asphalt portion of the turns at Martinsville, moved Sammy up the track physically, got him side by side with Allgaier going down the back stretch, and then Sammy completely sends it into turn 3, through the 54's bumper, spinning the 54 out, and caving in the front of his Pilot number 8 Chevy. From there, bedlam, just absolute heck, breaks loose. And Sammy does not end up winning after pulling a very desperate and very robust move, we'll say, and triggers in some way a massive pileup, very reminiscent of 2017 Martinsville in the fall, when Denny Hamlin decided to wreck everybody coming to the finish line. Now, here's my view of events. I think that anybody calling for a suspension for Sammy Smith is silly. Like, I'm just going to go ahead and say that right off the rip. I feel that we have seen this exact move happen 3 different times at Martinsville in the past, and I can pinpoint each of them. 2017 with Denny Hamlin and Chase Elliott. And Denny even referenced this on his podcast, and still, for whatever reason, he seems to maintain that that wasn't a purposeful move to have taken Elliott out. And I mean, maybe it wasn't, but you certainly didn't care about wiping him out, which is just as bad. Number 2, Ty Gibbs, 2022 Fall Xfinity Series race. Going into turn 1, just completely cleaned out Brandon Jones, even admitted it over the radio that he didn't intend to make the corner. NASCAR does nothing. He still gets his championship berth and goes on to win the title. Third time, Austin Hill, the very next year in the Xfinity Series, just completely dives into turn 3, very reminiscent to Sammy Smith, and hits Sheldon Creed, his teammate, so hard that it breaks his bumper bar and causes a very similar pileup to what we saw on Saturday night. And guess what? Still no penalties levied for anything that happened that night. So I think if we're going to go on precedent here, even penalizing Sammy, I guess, is a little extreme, but I would agree with it. I think that for a move like that, we have got to start policing what is happening on the track. And this could be a good place to start, even though it does feel like you're singling out a guy for something that has been clearly established by the series and the sanctioning body as an acceptable move in those situations. And if you even look back at the Austin Dillon Logano Hamlin incident from last year at Richmond, it was pretty clear that Dillon was penalized more so for the addition of the right rear hook to Denny Hamlin more so than he was for the cleaning out of Logano going into turn 3. So take all of that, mash it together, and here's where I have a problem with Parker Kligerman and Jamie McMurray. They had the audacity to call Alex Bowman getting shoved all the way to Tucson a completely clean move. Those are their words. A totally clean maneuver in order to get the victory. They called that way, but they raked Sammy Smith over the coals. And what I have a problem with is, sure, you could consider this instance a course correction based on the Phoenix reaction. I don't see it that way. I see it as this being a bit of a inconsistency or a hypocrisy at the worst. Because how could you see a guy junk another car the way that Eric Almirola did by just completely crushing both sides of the 17 car at Phoenix, and then you see what essentially started as only a lazy spin for Taylor Gray off of the front of Sammy Smith's car, and you call this like the worst thing you've ever seen when we saw the worst thing we've ever seen. It happened last year at Richmond, and I hope it never gets that bad again. Now, I get that what Sammy did was bad, and I don't disagree with anybody that wants to call that out, but when you're calling what Eric Almirola did completely clean, and then you're raking someone who basically just spun one guy out and he didn't even make contact with the wall, when you're calling that like one of the dirtiest moves you've ever seen, it leads people in the audience to believe that there is a bit of an incongruity in terms of what these two incidents represent. And I don't really feel that way. I feel like any contact where you are deliberately wrecking the opponent in order to win is Bush League and should not be, recognized with any sort of cleanliness attached to it. And for Almirola's incident to be categorized differently than Sammy Smith's, I just feel like that's a complete false equivalency. And at the end of the day, I just feel like this is more of a result of Kligerman and McMurray not really being as booth friendly, as experienced in the booth, that they're going to make these kinds of mistakes early on, and they'll probably hammer out more so what their booth ethical code is going to look like as time goes on. This is only race 7. So yeah, I know this is an extremely long-winded answer, but
please go.
I just like, I can't keep seeing these things from our booths where we have these former drivers in there that don't know how to call things, and it's starting to get a little bit out of hand on their end for me. But before I continue any further, I would like to hear what you have to say after hearing that mountain of evidence I just gave.
Sure. Well, there are two ways I will try to maybe not defend, but give a little grace to Parker and Jamie Mack here. Number one, I don't think two wrongs make a right. I would rather, I mean, I get there's the idea of consistency, but just because they called what I viewed to be a not so clean move at Phoenix, just because they called that clean, I wouldn't want them to also turn around and, for consistency purposes, call what I think was a not very clean move Saturday night a clean move just to be able to check the consistency box. At the very least, I think we can applaud them for calling this one out. We could say maybe it's inconsistent or it's hypocritical with what they did a few weeks back at Phoenix, but I think when you look at the mountain of evidence, as you so put it, to what we saw Saturday night, I think it's pretty clear, but that's not what we want to see. And I'll give credit to the booth where it's due for calling it out, even if I thought they came up a little bit short 3 weeks ago. But I will also say that being number one. Number two is, as much as, and I say this all the time on this show, as much as I may disagree with a stance that somebody's taking, I at least try to open my mind up and understand how a reasonable and sensible person could come to that conclusion. I may very strongly disagree with their conclusion, but I can look at the mountain of evidence that we have and see, okay, what are they seeing in this that leads them to believe what they're saying here? And again, I'm well aware, you have articulated perfectly several times, Alex Bowman got used up. I mean, both sides of that car. If that race had been one lap longer, there's no way he would have been able to continue it. Certainly not at the pace that he was running at to contend for the win. Maybe not even at all. The reality is, it was a one-time move. Almirola moved up the track, put him in the wall. Both cars stayed straight. Bowman still came across the line in second. At least Almirola won the race. In this particular incident on Saturday night, it started much further back going into turn 3 with still almost half a lap to go. Sammy Smith ended up turning the leader around. I know that, as you perfectly mentioned Saturday night, not too much damage to the 54 car, but when you dump the leader with the entire pack still coming, it leads for the possibility for more cars to get swept up in that. The leader got spun around, and then that wasn't the end of it, because Sammy Smith got out of shape, and once you see a move like that, I think drivers, subconsciously get in their mind that anything beyond that is fair game. And I think you saw that with the resulting carnage that we saw on the front stretch, which wiped out a good half dozen cars at least and left basically a roadblock on the start-finish line on the last lap. So again, I think neither move was clean. Obviously, I have problems with what Almirola did. I certainly have problems with what Sammy Smith did Saturday night. But I can understand where somebody could look at. I'm not saying I can understand where they could call it completely clean, but I can understand, and I think I might even agree with them, that what I saw Saturday night at Martinsville left an even more sour taste in my mouth because of how many cars got caught up in it and because of how long the incident dragged on, basically for the entire last half lap. And as I saw a clip of Mark Martin on a Door Bumper Clear before we came onto the show here tonight, at least Almirola won the race. Sammy Smith couldn't even do that, got well out of shape, and then was part of the carnage as they were all coming to the line there, and ended up barely hanging on to the top 10, as you can see on the results to the side of us here.
So even like Chris Wright getting to the top 10 because of the...
Yeah, I mean, and Brennan Poole up in fourth. I mean, you see Dean Thompson in sixth, some names that you're not too used to seeing up there in the top 10 in this series. So it was complete carnage and complete calamity. And so, again, I don't know that it's necessarily a defense of what we saw at Phoenix. I'm just saying I can certainly understand where, Parker or Jamie Mack, and I'm not in their minds. I don't know exactly, 100% of what their take on each of these two incidents are beyond what they articulated in the booth. But I can understand where they would look at it Saturday night and say that we don't want to see that in our sport. I think that was the general sentiment across the board if you looked at social media. And I thought it was quite ironic, as I said, on Twitter myself, quoting Dale Jr.'s tweet. Jr. was saying, even before any of this happened, the history that this track has and the prestige of winning a grandfather clock, the track deserves better than this. And then I quoted his tweet and said, the number font that this man worked so hard, fought so hard to bring back, made so famous, deserves better than what Sammy Smith just provided us on the last lap there. So that's all I can really say on that. I understand what you're saying about it being a little bit inconsistent, but I would rather the booth turn around and get it right the second time than say, well, we called Phoenix clean, so we have to call Martinsville clean. I think these are two separate incidents, and I can understand where you wouldn't view them as apples to apples necessarily.
Yeah, and I don't know. I feel like the thing that troubles me the most about this is when you call something like Almirola's finish clean, it's almost like a get out of jail free card for anybody to do anything on the final lap. At least that's how it feels to me. I mean, obviously, I don't know how much these Xfinity guys go back and watch the broadcasts and pay attention to what the announcers say, but it definitely gives the fans the impression that things like this are completely, they should be a green light instead of a red light. And I don't like that. I don't like when the fans are kind of given mixed messaging. It seemed like when Almirola did what he did, it was basically giving, the fans the impression that, well, it's gloves off on the final lap. Do whatever you got to do to get to the finish line first. And that is essentially what they were saying, continuing to double down on it in Phoenix. And then when somebody does take their gloves completely off and lays everything out on the line and throws the kitchen sink in there, that's when they had a problem. It comes off wrong to me. And I just feel like if they can go back to Phoenix and right their wrongs there as far as like what they said, it would have at least left a better impression for me going into the following week, and then obviously now into this race, where their stance seems to have changed on the final lap. It seems like I feel like that would have been a better path going forward. And unfortunately, that's not what we got. Now, the fans probably don't really know what is and what isn't off limits on the last lap, because if what Almirola did is completely clean, how is what Sammy Smith did that much more wrong that it is so, so grossly maligned like it has been the past 48 hours?
Sure. Well, I mean, and to that, I would say just kind of welcome to NASCAR, where we're consistently inconsistent on a whole multitude of issues, and that's the way that it's been for many, many years now. So, sadly, again, I mean, I can certainly, again, I can understand where you don't want to be. You want to make sure you're calling it out in all instances. And I also think, we can, I don't know if this really come up in the conversation, but Almirola is a veteran. I mean, he has enough experience that maybe you should say he should know better. He should be teaching the young drivers to race with a little bit more respect out there. Whereas Sammy Smith, not to defend him necessarily, but is a much younger driver, still trying to earn his wings, so to speak, in the Xfinity Series before he has any ambitions to move up to Cup. And I think, as we saw this weekend, certainly has a long way to go. Before we move on here, because we should talk about the race winner and what came out of all this carnage here. You kind of touched on it with saying, I think a suspension or even a penalty in some respects would be, again, inconsistent with what NASCAR's let go in the past here, particularly at this track. But in light of two wrongs not making a right, so to speak, do you think NASCAR should start stepping in? Should this be the moment, maybe much like what Bubba Wallace and Kyle Larson, that deal at Las Vegas was with the right rear hooks, at least until Austin Dillon did it last year? Is this something that should set a precedent for the future? Should we have stricter penalties if you just clean out the leader on the last lap and cost what was it? 28 positions for Taylor Gray?
Okay, well, let me ask you this before we go any further with this question. Are you asking me what I think I would do in this position if I was NASCAR, or are we asking what NASCAR is going to do? Because those are two completely different questions.
I would, if you were in charge, if you were the commissioner. Okay. That may or may not be.
We'll get into that.
Into what's coming up here in the open segment. If you were king for a day, as Ricky Craven said after the Martinsville insanity last year, if you were king for a day, you could make the decision for NASCAR on their behalf. What would you do regarding penalties for Sammy Smith or anybody involved in the last lap carnage?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be waiting until the middle of the year to set an ethical code, which NASCAR is just so curiously afraid to do. But if hypothetically I'm taking the reins today, here's what I would do. I would give Sammy Smith a 20-point penalty for his involvement in this, purely for driver points. I don't think the owner needs to be held accountable for this action. I think that'd be a little extreme, plus a $50,000 fine. And I would explain to everybody that the slate is wiped clean going forward, but if you wipe out the leader on the final lap in a deliberate attempt to manufacture an outcome, which is essentially what it is, it's manufacturing an outcome by wrecking the leader, that you will be sent to the last car on the lead lap. As a result, you will get the black flag as you cross the finish line, and whoever takes second wins the race. And I don't think it needs to be any more complicated than that. However, if I'm going off of what I think NASCAR is going to do going forward this week, I think they're going to not penalize him, wipe the slate clean, and then continue to reinforce that there's gray areas in this, and you all are subject to whatever our whims, produce. So, if it were me, a mild penalty, all things considered at this point in the season for Sammy. I think that what he did was a little much and a bit gratuitous, a bit robust, as I mentioned before. But again, it's not really anything we haven't seen before, even out of guys at the cup level at this track. And for me, it's really hard to really give him a stiff punishment, given what the precedent has been at this specific facility, even for this specific series.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. And I think that to the point you were making about Denny Hamlin, I know Denny went on his podcast today and called out not just Sammy Smith, but also Austin Hill. And I think Mayer was the third driver that he mentioned by name here and basically said they all drove like a-holes, on that last lap there. And then, of course, people could bring up 2017. Denny may be a hypocrite. I don't think he's necessarily wrong, though. I think that this has been an issue, not just in the Xfinity Series, but also clearly in Cup. And then, kind of to the point about, because people were saying, maybe, Taylor Gray had moved Sammy Smith up the track. I think a more extreme example of that is everybody remembers Denny dumping Chase Elliott. I think people forget, and all they have to do is just go back and play the radioactive from Fall Martinsville 2017. Chase Elliott drove Brad Keselowski up multiple lanes, and Keselowski was on the radio screaming, is this what we call racing here? But nobody seems to remember that part of the equation because Keselowski ultimately didn't get completely dumped. Elliott obviously got spun out, and Hamlin didn't even go on to win the race that time either. So there's a lot of layers to these situations and multiple examples. Again, it's hard to make complete apples to apples comparisons, but I do think that just making it a gray area and not having any sort of incident, where NASCAR can step in, I think, leads to the idea that this could happen again in the future.
I am so glad you brought up that Brad said that on the radio right before that incident happened, because what happened right before this incident this weekend? A driver got shoved up several grooves when they were, in my opinion, even after both shipping each other into turn one on the restart. It's so funny how this sport, for as much as it goes in circles, it just cycles and repeats itself. Yeah. And how soon we forget little minute details of what happened in 2017 that sparked such outrage at the time. How soon we forget those minute details when they represent themselves in the modern day. So I don't know. I find that a little interesting. That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, and I mean it's tough. It's admittedly tough because when you put 38 cars on a half-mile track, you're gonna have contact. And I think yes, bump and runs to a degree, are part of, as you mentioned, Martinsville lore and short track lore and NASCAR lore. The question then becomes, where do we draw the line? What is a bump and run versus a dump and run versus a dump and falling back, 10 spots because you couldn't even win the race because you overdrove the corner so much that you not only cleaned the guy out, but you cleaned the guy out and still didn't make it, even using the leader as a break there. I think there's, again, just the longer you let this continue to boil over and incidents like this happen, I think it exponentially increases, especially with all the young kids watching that are, now, the guys that were kids when Denny Hamlin did that to Chase Elliott are now racing here in the Xfinity Series 8 years later. And they see that happen even at the cup level. And they think, well, at worst, maybe I'll be fined or put on probation or something. So if it means I can win the race instead of finishing second, maybe it's worth it. I don't know. I just think that's a dangerous road to go down and precedent to set. But again, we've talked so much on this program, about consistent inconsistency that I'm with you. I think NASCAR probably should step in and give some sort of penalty or reprimand to Sammy Smith, but will they? I don't know. I guess we'll find out tomorrow, but we'll see.